He thought humiliating her in front of everyone would be easy, but before the morning ended, the entire room would question everything it believed about success. The grand ballroom of the Harrison Civic Center shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors reflecting the warm gold light of a spring fundraiser attended by the city's most influential names. Bank presidents, university trustees, media personalities, and donors in tailored suits moved from table to table with rehearsed smiles and polished laughter. Waiters carried silver trays through the crowd while a string quartet played softly near the stage. It was the kind of room where people judged each other in a single glance and rarely apologized for being wrong. At the registration desk stood Claire Bennett, wearing a simple navy cardigan, sensible flats, and a canvas tote bag that had clearly seen years of use. At 39, she carried herself with quiet steadiness, her brown hair tied back neatly, her expression calm in the way only someone deeply certain of herself could manage. Most guests assumed she was staff. A few assumed she was lost. None of them noticed the intelligence in her eyes. Claire placed an envelope on the desk and offered a polite smile. "I'm here to check in for the Education Scholarship Board meeting." The young assistant glanced at her list, then at Claire's clothes, then back at the list again. Before she could answer, a smooth voice cut through the air. "There must be some confusion." Daniel Mercer approached with the confidence of a man who had never been told no long enough to remember what it felt like. At 46, Daniel was president of Mercer Capital, headline speaker for the fundraiser, and famous in the city for turning modest companies into national brands. His charcoal suit fit perfectly, his silver watch flashed under the lights, and people instinctively made space when he walked by. He looked Claire over with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "This meeting is private," he said. "Board members only." Claire met his gaze without flinching. "That's why I'm here." Several nearby guests slowed their conversations just enough to listen. Daniel's smile sharpened. He enjoyed an audience. "I'm sure you mean well," he said, lowering his voice in a way designed to feel kind while sounding cruel, "but the volunteer orientation is downstairs." Claire glanced toward the assistant, who now looked terrified of saying the wrong thing. "I'm not here to volunteer," she replied. "I'm here for the board meeting." A hush drifted across the registration area. Public embarrassment had begun, and people loved to witness it as long as they were not the target. Daniel rested one hand on the desk. "Let me save everyone time. The scholarship board handles 8-figure commitments, national partnerships, and university policy. It can be overwhelming if someone walks into the wrong room. You should probably head downstairs before security mistakes this for trespassing." A few people chuckled softly. Claire's face did not change. She simply adjusted the strap of her tote bag. Across the room, the quartet continued playing as if nothing had happened. She had heard versions of this tone before in airports, offices, restaurants, conferences, and charity events where appearance mattered more than character. She had learned long ago that some people revealed themselves fastest when they believed they held power. Daniel turned to the crowd with a gracious shrug, already performing victory. "These things happen," he said. "We all want to help worthy causes." The room rewarded him with polite smiles. Claire looked at the stage where a giant screen displayed the morning's slogan, "Investing in Tomorrow." Then she looked back at Daniel. "Interesting phrase," she said softly. He raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? Investing in tomorrow. It sounds noble. It's just unfortunate when people can't recognize it standing in front of them today." The assistant at the desk blinked. Daniel's jaw tightened for the first time. "You're being inappropriate now," he said. Claire nodded once, almost sympathetically. "And you're being careless." There was something in her tone that caused several listeners to straighten. Not louder, not sharper, simply certain. Daniel laughed, but the sound came half a second late. "I don't know who you think you are." Claire reached into her tote bag and removed a slim leather folder, placing it gently on the registration desk. The embossed seal on the cover caught the light. The assistant gasped before she could stop herself. Daniel glanced down, then back up, confusion breaking through his practiced expression. Claire Bennett opened the folder and slid a signed document across the desk. "Please let everyone know the meeting can begin," she said. "As of 8 a.m., I completed the acquisition of Mercer Capital's controlling debt and finalized the transfer terms with the board. Which means, Mr. Mercer, you no longer host this event. You report to it." The room went silent. No one moved for several seconds. Even the quartet near the stage had faltered into silence, bows hovering above strings as if the musicians themselves needed confirmation that they had heard correctly. Daniel Mercer stared at the document on the desk, then at the woman he had dismissed less than a minute earlier. The polished certainty that usually surrounded him had cracked so suddenly that he seemed older under the chandelier light. Claire Bennett remained composed, one hand resting lightly on her canvas tote, as if this moment were nothing more than a delayed appointment finally beginning on time. The registration assistant looked from one face to the other, then down again at the folder bearing signatures she recognized from headlines and annual reports. She swallowed hard. "Mr. Mercer," she whispered, "the board authorized an emergency vote at 7:30 this morning." Daniel's eyes snapped toward her. "Why was I not informed?" "Because," Claire answered before the young woman could panic further, "the notice was sent to your private office at 6:45. Your chief counsel acknowledged receipt at 6:52. A murmur rippled through the guests. Executives disliked surprises unless they were delivering them. Daniel straightened his tie, instinctively trying to restore control through posture alone. "This is a stunt," he said. "Debt instruments do not transfer authority in a ballroom." Claire tilted her head slightly. "No, they transfer authority in conference rooms, legal offices, and very long nights where people finally grow tired of arrogance costing them money. Then they are announced in ballrooms." A few guests turned away to hide smiles. Others pretended to study their phones. Public loyalty often disappeared the moment power changed direction. Daniel lowered his voice. "If you think embarrassing me will help your position, you misunderstand this city." Claire's expression softened, but not kindly. "I understand this city very well. I understand who funds scholarships for applause and who funds them because children need a chance. I understand who puts their name on buildings and who pays teachers quietly. Most of all, I understand that too many people here confuse reputation with character." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Near the entrance, a trustee in a burgundy dress stepped forward. Margaret Ellison, chair of the scholarship board, extended her hand toward Claire. "Ms. Bennett, welcome. We appreciate your discretion through the transition." Claire shook her hand warmly. "Students deserve stability first," she replied. "Headlines can wait." Daniel looked between them in disbelief. "You knew about this?" Margaret met his stare with the calm of someone finished being intimidated. "We all knew enough, Daniel. We simply waited until the contracts were final. You have spent 3 years treating this foundation like a stage for yourself. It was time someone remembered the mission." Across the lobby, donors who had once surrounded Daniel now drifted toward safer conversations. The geometry of influence had rearranged itself in real time. Claire picked up the folder and offered it back to the assistant. "Please update the seating chart," she said. "And move the scholarship recipients to the front tables. They should not spend the morning behind sponsors who came for photographs." "Yes, ma'am," the assistant said instantly, relief visible in her face. Daniel let out a brittle laugh. "So this is personal revenge?" Claire looked at him steadily. "If it were personal, I would have arrived later and let you speak first. This is governance." Then she stepped past him toward the ballroom doors. Her sensible flats crossed the marble floor with quiet certainty while the room parted without being asked. And for the first time in years, Daniel Mercer understood what power looked like when it did not need to announce itself. The ballroom doors closed behind Claire Bennett with a soft hush that somehow sounded louder than applause. Inside, rows of round tables faced the stage where a giant screen still glowed with promises about opportunity and leadership. Yet the room now carried a different lesson entirely. Guests took their seats with the cautious energy of people who realized they had misjudged the most important person in attendance. Claire walked directly to the front without hurry, greeting servers by name when she passed them, thanking a custodian adjusting a cable near the podium, and pausing to help an elderly donor settle into her chair. Those small gestures were noticed more than any luxury watch could have been. Daniel Mercer entered moments later. He still wore the same tailored suit, but confidence no longer fit him as cleanly. Conversations lowered when he passed. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered the thin smiles reserved for men whose influence might be temporary. He reached the front row and found his nameplate missing from center table. In its place, a smaller card had been moved 2 rows back beside the side aisle. The room noticed that too. Margaret Ellison stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience during an important transition. Today remains about scholarship recipients and the future of this city." She gestured toward Claire. "Please welcome the new executive chair of the foundation, Ms. Claire Bennett." The applause began uncertainly, then grew stronger as people followed the safest current in the room. Claire accepted it with a nod rather than a smile and approached the podium carrying no notes. Daniel watched with folded arms, searching for weakness. He expected hesitation, maybe emotion, perhaps a symbolic speech built on surprise. What he heard instead unsettled him more deeply. For years, Claire began, this foundation has measured success by gala totals, media impressions, and donor visibility. Those numbers matter, but they are not the mission. A scholarship is not a decoration for annual reports. It is rent paid on time for a single mother in nursing school. It is books for a first-generation student working 2 jobs. It is a train ticket home at Thanksgiving for someone too proud to ask for help. The ballroom grew still. Claire's voice was calm, clear, and impossible to dismiss. Effective immediately, administrative costs will be reduced by 28%. Executive travel reimbursements are suspended pending review. Marketing contracts will be audited. Beginning this fall, every qualified finalist will receive emergency housing support and textbook grants in addition to tuition awards. Heads turned across the tables. Several trustees exchanged startled looks. They had expected symbolism. She was delivering mathematics. Daniel rose halfway from his chair. "Those measures require board consent." Claire glanced toward him. "They already received it at 7:32 this morning. Signed unanimously after the financial review was distributed." Daniel sat back down slowly. A few people near him shifted their chairs an inch farther away. Claire continued. "There is one more change. Scholarship applicants will no longer be required to attend donor dinners or perform gratitude for funding they earned through merit. Dignity will not be a condition of assistance." This time the applause came quickly and without instruction. Even some of the wealthiest guests clapped because resisting would expose too much. Daniel did not move. Claire looked across the room, not at him but through the culture he represented. Too often, institutions become mirrors for ego. Starting today, this one returns to being a bridge. The word settled over the ballroom like clear light after a storm. And in that moment, many people understood why a woman in sensible flats had walked in carrying a canvas tote instead of announcing herself first. Real authority rarely needs an entrance. Applause continued several seconds after Claire Bennett stepped away from the podium, not because the room was generous, but because many people needed cover for changing sides so quickly. When the sound finally faded, breakfast service resumed with the awkward precision of a machine restarting after a power surge. Silver lids lifted, coffee poured, chairs shifted, and whispered conversations spread like wine through tall grass. Yet every table carried the same subject. Who exactly was Claire Bennett? Daniel Mercer remained seated 2 rows back, untouched fruit in front of him, jaw set so firmly it seemed painful. He had spent years controlling rooms through anticipation. He knew what people wanted before they asked, who feared embarrassment, who could be flattered, who could be pressured. But Claire had arrived immune to every tool he trusted. Across the ballroom, Claire moved from table to table speaking first with scholarship finalists rather than donors. A young man in a borrowed blazer rose nervously when she approached. "Please stay seated," she told him kindly. "Today you are the guest of honor." The student blinked in surprise. Nearby trustees noticed and quietly sat straighter themselves. At another table, Claire asked a nursing student about childcare costs, then asked a veteran transferring colleges about housing waitlists. She listened more than she spoke, and that made people tell the truth. Daniel could not ignore it any longer. He stood and crossed the room with measured calm, collecting eyes as he went. When he reached her, several conversations stopped mid-sentence. Claire turned as if she had expected him at this exact minute. "You engineered this carefully," Daniel said in a low voice. Claire sipped water before answering. Competence often looks like engineering to people accustomed to improvising with privilege. His expression tightened. "You think donors will stay after humiliating me?" "I think donors stay where results are real," she replied. "If some leave because a title changed, they were renting attention, not giving support." A few guests nearby lowered their heads to hide reactions. Daniel stepped closer, careful to remain polished. "You have no idea how difficult it is to build institutions." Claire met his stare evenly. "I know exactly how difficult it is. I built 3 scholarship networks in counties no one in this room can locate on a map. I negotiated broadband access for rural schools while executives debated logo placement. I raised funds in church basements, community gyms, and libraries with broken air conditioning. Do not confuse visibility with labor." For the first time that morning, Daniel had no immediate reply. Margaret Ellison approached holding a tablet. "Daniel, before I forget, the audit committee needs clarification on last year's consulting invoices. They appear linked to a firm registered at your summer address." Several heads turned with the speed of instinct. Daniel's face changed by 1 careful degree. "We can discuss that privately." "We will," Margaret said. "At 10:05. With counsel present." She walked away before he could answer. Silence pooled around him. Claire did not smile. She simply adjusted the cuff of her cardigan. "You should sit down, Daniel," she said softly. "It is easier to think when no one is performing." He laughed once, but it sounded hollow. "You enjoy this?" "No," Claire replied. "I enjoy watching institutions become honest. There is a difference." She turned from him and greeted an elderly woman with a walker who had just entered the room. Daniel remained standing alone beside a half-cleared table while servers moved around him like water around stone. In every corner of the ballroom, people understood the same thing at once. His greatest weakness had never been greed or vanity. It was assuming quiet people had no history. At 10:05 sharp, the ballroom no longer felt like a fundraiser. It felt like a courtroom without robes. The breakfast plates had been cleared, the coffee refreshed, and every guest who claimed to have another appointment somehow remained in their seat. Curiosity was the one schedule no powerful person ever ignored. Near the stage, a long table had been arranged for the audit committee. Margaret Ellison sat at the center beside legal counsel and 2 senior trustees whose expressions suggested they had already slept badly after reading the morning files. Daniel Mercer approached with practiced composure, though the loosened knot of his tie betrayed a difficult hour. Claire Bennett took a chair at the far end with a yellow legal pad and a plain pen, looking less like a conqueror than the only adult prepared for homework. Margaret adjusted her glasses. "We will keep this simple. Last year, the foundation paid $1.8 million in strategic advisory fees to Northbridge Consulting. Records show no deliverables, no staff roster, and no physical office beyond a mail suite. Daniel folded his hands. Many firms operate virtually. One trustee slid a folder across the table. This firm was managed by a holding company connected to your summer property in Nantucket. Another trustee added, and billed us for donor acquisition despite donors already being in our database. A murmur moved through the audience. Daniel looked toward Claire. This timing is convenient. Claire did not glance up from her notes. Accountability often feels rude when it arrives on time. Margaret continued. There are also travel reimbursements for private charter flights to conferences that were never attended. Daniel straightened. Those trips were business development. For whom, Margaret asked, the scholarship students or your golf partners? A few guests stared into their cups with heroic concentration. Daniel's voice sharpened. I built this donor network. Without me, this foundation would still be hosting bake sales in church basements. Claire finally looked up. Those bake sales funded the first 32 nurses, 14 teachers, and 9 engineers this foundation ever helped. My mother organized 3 of them while working night shifts. The room went still. Daniel blinked. You were involved back then. Claire nodded once. Since I was 16. Folding chairs, handwritten receipts, hauling tables into borrowed gyms. We did not have branding consultants. We had neighbors. Several older donors exchanged startled looks as memory rearranged itself. They remembered a quiet teenager carrying boxes years ago. They had never asked her name. Margaret turned another page. There is one final matter. The proposed executive bonus package you submitted for yourself last month. Daniel said nothing. The figure on the screen behind the stage appeared in large black numbers. $750,000. Audible gasps rose across the ballroom. Claire closed her notebook gently. That amount would fully fund 100 emergency grants, she said. Or keep 200 students housed through winter break. Daniel's control finally thinned. You sanctimonious people enjoy pretending money is easy. You have no idea what pressure leadership requires. Claire's answer came quietly. Pressure does not entitle theft disguised as paperwork. Silence struck harder than outrage. Margaret leaned toward the microphone. Effective immediately, Daniel Mercer is removed from all advisory roles pending civil review and referral to regulators where required. Security at the doors did not move because they did not need to. Daniel looked around the room for allies and found only lowered eyes, careful faces, and distance. He gathered his briefcase himself. As he walked toward the exit, no one stopped him, no one applauded, and no one followed. Claire watched only long enough to be certain the door closed behind him. Then she turned back to the scholarship finalists and asked who still needed help paying for textbooks. The ballroom doors had barely stopped swinging when the atmosphere changed again. Tension left the room in visible waves, replaced by something rarer than luxury or influence, relief. People who had spent years speaking carefully around Daniel Mercer suddenly rediscovered their natural voices. Conversations warmed. Laughter returned, softer this time and more honest. The giant screen behind the stage still displayed polished slogans, but they now seemed outdated beside what everyone had just witnessed. Claire Bennett remained at the committee table only long enough to sign 3 resolutions, redirect 2 discretionary funds, and authorize immediate release of emergency aid for students whose payments were overdue. Then she stood, carried her own folder, and walked away from the front of the room as if titles weighed less than paper. A scholarship finalist named Maya Rodriguez approached her first, clutching a notebook to her chest. Ms. Bennett, I was going to decline the award, she said quietly. My housing deposit is due next week, and I could not cover both. Claire's expression softened. You are no longer choosing between education and shelter, she replied. She motioned to an administrator nearby. Process her emergency grant before noon. Maya covered her mouth, tears rising instantly. Across the ballroom, other students began stepping forward one by one. A veteran needing adaptive equipment. A father returning to school who needed childcare assistance. A young man who had been sleeping in his car between classes. Claire listened to each story without rushing anyone. She asked practical questions, wrote notes in careful handwriting, and gave instructions that turned problems into timelines. It became obvious why people trusted her before they knew her name. Margaret Ellison watched from a distance and smiled for the first time all morning. One trustee leaned toward her. Why did she stay hidden so long? Margaret answered without taking her eyes off Claire. She was never hidden. Some people only notice those who arrive loudly. Near the rear tables, donors who had once funded vanity projects now approached with unusual humility. One couple offered to sponsor textbook grants anonymously. Another pledged transportation vouchers for commuter students. A retired surgeon asked whether the foundation had considered mental health support. Claire thanked each of them but redirected every conversation toward outcomes, budgets, and accountability. Glamour could not survive long under fluorescent honesty. By noon, servers were clearing the final coffee cups when the young registration assistant who had frozen earlier approached Claire nervously. "I should have spoken up this morning," she said. "I knew your name was on the list." Claire looked at her kindly. "Fear is expensive in rooms like this. Courage takes practice." Then she handed the assistant a business card. "We need operations staff who notice details. Apply if you are interested." The woman stared at the card as though it were impossible. Across the marble lobby, sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching dust in the air like gold. Claire finally lifted her canvas tote and prepared to leave. A reporter waiting near the entrance hurried forward. "Ms. Bennett, one comment please. How does it feel to take control of one of the city's most influential foundations?" Claire paused only a moment. "Control is overrated," she said. "Stewardship matters more." Then she stepped outside into the bright afternoon where no cameras had been invited. Inside, the room remained quiet after she left, not because people had nothing to say, but because they were still measuring themselves against what dignity had just looked like. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the city had already begun rewriting the story. News sites framed it as a dramatic leadership shakeup. Business columns called it a governance correction. Social media preferred shorter language and sharper satisfaction. Yet none of those versions captured what truly mattered. In neighborhoods far from marble floors and crystal chandeliers, students were receiving emails that changed the shape of their futures. At a small apartment 12 miles from downtown, Maya Rodriguez refreshed her inbox every 30 seconds while her younger brother did homework at the kitchen table. When the message arrived, she read it twice before breathing. Emergency housing grant approved. Tuition secured. Orientation stipend released. She sat down slowly and laughed through tears she had tried to hold all morning. Across town, Thomas Green, a former Navy medic returning to college at 34, opened confirmation that adaptive equipment and transportation assistance would be ready before classes began. In a laundromat parking lot, Jamal Carter read that temporary campus housing had been arranged, ending the weeks he had spent sleeping in his sedan. None of them knew one another. All of them knew relief. At Foundation headquarters, Claire Bennett stood in a plain conference room with fluorescent lights and a table scarred by years of coffee cups. She preferred it immediately. No chandeliers. No speeches. Only work. Staff members who had once moved cautiously now entered carrying folders with visible energy. Claire listened to reports, reassigned bloated marketing budgets to student support, and asked for a complete list of applicants previously denied over minor paperwork delays. If someone needed help but missed a deadline because they were working 2 jobs, she said, that is not irresponsibility. That is context. Fix it. Pens moved quickly around the room. A senior accountant hesitated before speaking. "Ms. Bennett, there is one concern. Some donors may withdraw after today. Claire nodded. Some will. Then she folded her hands. If generosity disappears when ego is inconvenienced, it was never generosity. Replace it with partners who believe in outcomes. The accountant wrote that down as if it belonged in a textbook. Near 5 o'clock, Margaret Ellison arrived carrying a cardboard box. "I thought these were yours," she said, setting it on the table. Inside were faded photos, handwritten ledgers, and old event flyers from the foundation's earliest years. On top sat a picture of teenagers stacking folding chairs in a church basement. One of them was Claire at 16, hair tied back, smiling despite obvious exhaustion. Margaret watched her quietly. "You should tell them who you are." Claire looked at the photo for a long moment. "They know enough." Margaret smiled. "They know what you did today. They do not know what you did for 20 years before anyone was watching." Claire closed the box gently. "Then maybe they should learn to value work they cannot photograph." As evening settled over the city, a final visitor arrived at reception. The young registration assistant from the ballroom stood there holding a printed resume. Claire invited her in immediately. "I have never worked anywhere important," the young woman said nervously. Claire handed the resume back. "Important places are not defined by furniture. Can you solve problems, notice details, and treat people well when no one rewards you for it?" The woman blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Claire said. "You start Monday." Outside the office windows, downtown lights flickered on one by one. Inside, something brighter had already begun. Not a takeover. Not revenge. A return. 3 weeks later, the Foundation's headquarters no longer resembled the polished monument it had once pretended to be. The expensive artwork in the lobby had been auctioned for student emergency funds. The oversized donor wall had been replaced by a digital screen listing graduation dates, internship placements, and first-generation college milestones. Fresh paint covered years of decorative vanity, and the building finally looked like a place designed for work instead of admiration. Claire Bennett arrived each morning at 7:45 carrying the same canvas tote. She still wore cardigans, practical shoes, and no visible symbols of status. Yet now security guards greeted her by name, interns held doors without being asked, and executives who once ignored support staff had learned to say good morning to everyone. Culture changes slowly until it changes all at once. In the main conference room, Claire reviewed the first monthly report under the new structure. Application approvals were up 42%. Administrative spending had dropped by a third. Student retention projections were the strongest in Foundation history. No one in the room celebrated loudly. They were too busy understanding what competence looked like when freed from theater. The young receptionist Claire had hired, now training in operations, entered with a stack of letters. "More thank you notes," she said. Claire glanced at them and smiled faintly. "File them by program. Gratitude is kind, but data helps more." Around town, the effects were becoming visible. Maya Rodriguez moved into campus housing and started pre-med orientation with rent already covered. Thomas Green began classes using the adaptive equipment he had nearly gone without. Jamal Carter no longer slept in a parking lot and had joined the engineering lab 3 days early. Their names would never appear on gala banners, yet they were the only proof that mattered. Not everyone welcomed the changes. A small circle of former insiders complained in private clubs and curated dining rooms. They said standards were slipping. They said prestige was being diluted. They said the city was losing tradition. What they meant was simpler. They missed being centered. Claire heard about the criticism and responded by extending library hours, funding mental health counseling, and publishing every executive expense online. Transparency is a difficult opponent because it does not tire. One Friday afternoon, a local television host requested an exclusive interview in the newly renovated lobby. Cameras arrived, lights were adjusted, and producers practiced flattering introductions. Claire sat down only after asking whether the crew had been offered lunch. The host smiled brightly. "Ms. Bennett, many call you the woman who took over the city's most powerful charity. How does it feel to become a symbol?" Claire folded her hands. "Symbols are decorative. Students need systems." The host laughed uncertainly and tried again. "But surely you enjoy the recognition after what happened last month." Claire looked directly into the camera. "Recognition is pleasant. Rent paid on time is better." A producer nearly dropped his clipboard trying not to react. The clip spread across the city before sunset. Even those who disliked her reforms admitted she had a gift for making vanity sound small. That evening, after the cameras left and the elevators quieted, Claire remained alone in the conference room reviewing a list of applicants who had appealed old denials. She circled names, added notes, and approved extensions one by one. Outside the windows, downtown lights shimmered against the river. Inside, there was only the scratch of a pen and the steady rhythm of someone who never needed applause to keep going. Some people rise after humiliation to prove others wrong. Claire had risen for a harder reason. To make sure the next person would not need to. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the Harrison Civic Center filled again beneath the same chandeliers, the same marble shine, the same polished tables dressed for another scholarship ceremony. Yet nothing about the room felt the same. The front tables no longer belonged to donors or executives. They were reserved for students and their families. Parents held phones with trembling hands. Younger siblings swung their legs beneath linen cloths. Faculty mentors sat beside veterans, single mothers, transfer students, and first-generation graduates whose names would soon be called one by one. Along the side walls, former sponsors stood wherever space remained. Influence had not vanished. It had simply been reseated. Claire Bennett arrived through the front entrance carrying the same canvas tote she had brought on the morning everyone underestimated her. Several people noticed and smiled before she reached the registration desk. The young assistant she had hired months earlier now managed the event with calm authority. "Check-in complete," she said proudly. "Every student has transportation home, meal vouchers, and emergency contacts confirmed." Claire nodded with quiet approval. "Excellent work." Across the ballroom, Maya Rodriguez adjusted a white coat she had earned through her first clinical placement. Thomas Green spoke with engineering recruiters near a display table. Jamal Carter stood beside a prototype built in the university lab, explaining circuits to a middle school student who stared at him like he was already famous. None of them looked rescued. They looked ready. Margaret Ellison approached the podium and welcomed the crowd. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate the largest graduating class in Foundation history." Applause thundered through the room. She smiled toward Claire. "And we celebrate a year in which overhead fell, outcomes rose, and dignity was restored to our mission." Then she invited Claire to speak. Claire stood before the microphone, glanced across the sea of faces, and let the room settle naturally. "Years ago," she began, "this event rewarded wealth with the best seats and asked students to be grateful from the back of the room. We had the order reversed." Soft laughter moved through the crowd. She continued. "Assistance is not charity when talent has already earned it. Opportunity is not a favor. It is an investment that pays communities back for generations." She then did something no one expected. Instead of continuing, she stepped aside and invited 3 graduates to the stage to tell their own stories. Maya spoke of becoming the first doctor in her family. Thomas spoke of service continuing in a classroom. Jamal spoke of sleeping in a car and now designing clean energy systems. By the time they finished, many guests were wiping tears they had not planned to feel. Near the rear of the ballroom, Daniel Mercer stood alone in a dark suit purchased for rooms that no longer opened for him. He had come quietly, without announcement, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps regret. No one mocked him. No one needed to. He watched as the audience rose in a standing ovation for students he once considered background scenery. Claire noticed him only briefly. Then she returned her attention to the stage where it belonged. As the ceremony ended, families flooded the room with hugs, laughter, and photographs too joyful to be curated. Claire slipped away toward the exit before anyone could stop her for praise. Outside, evening air carried the sounds of celebration through the open doors behind her. She adjusted the strap of her tote and walked into the city without escort or spotlight. Inside, the applause continued after she was gone. Some victories are loud for a night. Others keep working long after the room falls silent.